Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this public forum on tax exemption program for everyone. It's sponsored by Envision Mashpee. Envision Mashpee is a very informal grassroots group. We worked on issues like clean water, getting housing for people who need it, and in general, preserving the small town character of Mashpee. You can find us on the internet, on our website, which is envisionmashpee.org, and also on Facebook. You can message us on Facebook for those people who will be seeing this on Mashpee TV. It's not broadcast live, but it will be posted. So, if you want to be on our mailing list, please sign in and check off that you want to be on our mailing list. We don't do a whole lot of mailings. So, the purpose tonight is to provide information for people. It's not to get opinions one way or the other way. So we would be happy to have questions. Our speakers are willing to answer questions, but we need those questions in writing so that we can maximize the question time. Each speaker has a PowerPoint and will speak fairly briefly, I think, and then we'll have time for questions. We are trying to get out of the room by 8 o'clock. So, now, our speakers who we're very happy to have with us are John Curran, who is the Director of Assessing for the town of Barnstable. He formerly was the assessor for the town of Westwood. He has very deep ties in Mashpee. He's been coming here since 1970, I think you said.
Correct.
And he's looking to move here, so he's not a stranger to Mashpee. Before he was an assessor, he was an independent real estate appraiser since 1993.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Andrew Gottlieb, I think most people know. He is the executive director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. He served 5 terms as a member of Mashpee's Select Board. And so, without further ado, John. Oh, one more thing before you speak. Arden Russell, who's over there in pink, will be collecting the cards for questions. So if you have cards and questions, she'll be around to get them. And I hope we'll get to all of them. Thank you, John.
All right, well, thank you. And as Margie mentioned, my name is John Curran. I'm the Director of Assessing in Barnstable. And I just wanted to make sure, can everyone see this? Do you think we need to dim the lights at all?
Yeah, probably.
Dim the lights? Yeah. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go back.
It's like a movie.
Perfect.
All right, so I'm here to talk about the residential exemption today and just how it's applied. So I'll get going right there. We are going to be understanding the residential exemption. What is the residential exemption? The residential exemption was enacted in 1979. It's a residential tax exemption. It's an option under Property Tax Classification, Mass General Law, Chapter 59, Section 5C. It shifts the tax burden within the residential classes from the owners of moderately valued residential properties to the owners of vacation homes, higher valued homes, residential properties not occupied by owners, including large apartment complexes and vacant land. How does it work? The communities may authorize the residential exemption to all Class 1 properties. Class 1 properties are just residential properties. It could be a 90-unit apartment complex, a vacant residential lot, 1, 2, 3, 4 family, and condominiums. all residential, class 1 residential properties. That are principal residence, that's the key factor of this. It has to be your primary residence. You have to occupy that property on January 1st of the prior fiscal year. Prior to the Municipal Modernization Act, the exemption could not top 20% of the average assessed valuation of all residential parcels. Now, the exemptions cannot exceed 35% of the average assessed value of all Class 1 residential properties. How does it work? Continued. Adopting the residential tax exemption increases the residential rate. The amount of the tax levy that the town needs to raise, paid by the residential class, that remains the same. But because of the exempted residential valuation, the levy is distributed over less assessed value. The higher rate creates a shift within the class that reduces the taxes paid by the homeowners of moderately valued properties. Those taxes are then paid by non-owner occupied residential properties. How it's calculated. So I have a lot of math right on this area. You'll see all these codes. As I go forward on the slides, we'll walk right through an example of how it's all calculated. So, how it's calculated continued. The total residential value, that's taking all residential properties, what their assessed value is, adding it together. So for our example, the total residential value is $8 billion. And we're going to divide that by the total count of residential parcels. In this particular case, it's 12,500. So when we divide the 12,500 by the 8 billion, it equals $640,000. The average residential value, now we know what the average residential value in this fictitious town is. This is in Barnstable, this is in Mashpee, this is a fictitious town. The average residential value is then multiplied by the selected residential exemption that the select board will pick to get the residential exemption. So we would take that 640,000 average residential value and multiply it by the 30%, and that would give us our residential exemption of $192,000. The residential exemption is then multiplied by the number of eligible parcels, resulting in the total residential exemption. So in this case, we're taking the $192,000 that we previously determined. Out of those 12,500 residential properties, 8,500 of them are full-time residents and eligible for the residential exemption. So that equals the $1,632,000,000 that is going to be exempted. So that's the amount that is exempted from the total Class 1 valuation. The total residential value is then reduced by the total residential exemption value to determine the total residential value minus exemption. So in this case, we're going to take the $8 billion minus the $1.6 billion, and it leaves us remaining with $6,368,000,000. That value, H, the $6,368,000,000, is used to calculate the residential class rate. Because the total residential exemption value, the residential class tax rate increases. The total levy, the amount of money to be raised by the town to support all the services, the total tax levy for the residential class, that stays the same. The property tax burden shifts over to the second homeowners and that. Now we have to talk about the break-even point. This is the point where the assessed valuation of a parcel without any exemption is benefit neutral. The break-even point is calculated as the total residential value divided by the number of eligible parcels. So in this particular case, we have the $8 billion is the total value of all residential property, dividing it by the eligible parcels for the residential exemption, and that would give us any property that's valued at $941,176 or above. They could still be in the program, they're just not going to see the benefits of it that the properties assessed lower than that would see. So here's some example. Who benefits? For the owner-occupied properties, and we're going to look at the column 1, where it says property number 1, we can see we have property value with an assessed value of $400,000. Their current tax bill, yearly obligation would be the $3,936. When we go down below a little more, it's still the same $400,000 value. We're exempting $192,000 of that we had previously calculated. And that's going to give us a new net value of taxable assessed value of $208,000. So a tax bill with a 30% exemption would be $2,556, down from the $3,936, which would be actual savings of $1,379 for $400,000. The more expensive the properties get, the amount of savings and benefit that you'll get from this will decrease slowly. So then we go up to a property that's assessed at $640,000, would have a $6,200 roughly annual tax bill, keeping everything the same, the 30% exemption on that. It's that 640 property, we apply the 192 residential exemption, so now they're only being assessed on the 448, which lowers the total tax liability to the $5,500, saving them $791 roughly. Now we're getting into at the break-even point. Property number 3 is right at our break-even point that we had calculated earlier. So you can see their liability would be $9,261. We apply the residential exemption to them. Their taxable bill goes down to the $749. But because that 30% exemption is there, the mill rate, as we call it, the per thousand rate is going to be slightly higher. So they're not going to, they will save about $53. So I shouldn't say you don't get anything, it's just not as much. But once we start going more expensive than that, on the higher assessed properties, you'll see how it goes from $1.5 million property, they pay about $14,000 in taxes. It goes down because of the new rate that's shifting over that $1,500,000 property that does not, that does qualify for the exemption. They would end up paying about $3,600 more because how the values shift on that. And we'll get clearer in this next slide. Who doesn't benefit? That's the other end of the equation here. So non-eligible properties with the exemption program. We can see right here, property 1 is a non-owner occupied property. They don't have an exemption. How much more would they pay because of the residential exemption? The non-owner occupied property in that $400,000 range, they're going to pay about $980 more. Keeping the same numbers, a $640,000 property that is non-owner occupied, they're going to pay about $1,500 more. It goes right down the line. Property 3 that's at our break-even point, without a residential exemption, non-owner occupied, is going to pay about $2,300 more. And the $1,500,000 property is going to pay about $3,600 more. Here are some examples of how they would affect some large apartment buildings. We definitely have them in Barnstable. I'm not sure if there's large rental apartment complexes in Mashpee. But an apartment complex that has a $20 million value would usually have tax liability at this fictitious tax rate of $196,800. Tax bill with the 30%. We go up to $245. The difference from being in the program versus not in the program is about $49,000. And then we go up to $50,000, and as the values increase, the difference between the program and not in the program increases as well. So it goes up to the increase for roughly $50 million property, $122,500. And for a $100 million property, it could increase their liability by $245,000. So the break-even point's what I'm trying to emphasize here. Yes, you're a resident, you qualify for the program, you are in the program, you just will not see the benefits, someone that's have that. And that's something you have to speak with the local town assessor. He'll present at the classification hearing what the break-even point is, and they'll be able to calculate it from there and decide. What if it went up to 35%? You know, everything we just calculated was at 30%. Same exact math, just a different percentage, but you can see we're going up to 35% versus 30. So at the top half of the screen, you'll see the 30%. On that $400,000 property, as we mentioned, it was about a $1,300 savings. If you go up that extra 5%, it goes up to about a $1,600 savings. Same thing with the $640,000 property. 30% is about $791 savings in taxes. 35% is $922. So a few percentage points can make a big difference in the dollars saved. And then, of course, we get up to the break-even point again, where they had a minor benefit at that, at $52, but at 35%, it decreases down to about a $4 savings. And it just, on the higher priced properties, they're paying about $3,600 more. If you go up to 35%, they're going to pay about $4,600 more. Because that money doesn't go away, we still have to raise the amount of the levy, and it's spread out amongst the other properties in that class. How much more would 35% cost non-eligible properties? So these are our second homes, the ones that are not eligible. And these are also staying with the apartment complexes. So we can see bigger numbers, bigger assessed values are going to be bigger savings on the 30% versus the 35%. So it's about a $49,000 savings at 30%, and then tax bill at 35%, it's $258. So you save about $12,600 from the 30% versus the 35%, and it goes right down the line. It's just the economics of it, how the more expensive the property goes, the more savings that are either passed on or granted on that end. So that is it in a nutshell. I'm sure people have questions, but as Margie said, please just write them down. We'll take them, and I'll be around afterwards to speak to anyone and answer anything individually. So if anyone had any questions, but I think that first group should be writing the questions down and submitting them, and we'll take them as they come. Thank you, everyone.
I want to stress again, this is an informational session. If you have opinions, the time to voice those is November 6th, when the Select Board has a hearing on this at Town Hall, 5 o'clock, and questions should be asked then, public comment will be made then, and the Mashpee tax assessor will be there at that meeting, so he can also be questioned, and he'll be explaining particular things for Mashpee.
Okay, so word of caution. Marge asked me several months ago if I had any suggestions, people that could present today, and I said yes. I gave her a list of names, and then she drafted me. So if she calls you, be careful. Watch out. So before we jump into some of the detail here, taxes, very few people understand how taxes are calculated in Massachusetts. And partly because it's math. So you all probably thought you're never going to use algebra again. But it's the key to understanding why all this works the way it does. So towns are allowed to collect a given amount of money. So it's the right side of the equal sign. The two factors on the left side of the equal sign, property values versus times tax rate. That gives you how much money you can get. In this scenario, where the town collects the same amount of money with a residential exemption or without a residential exemption, that right side of the equal sign is fixed. So if the rate goes up, if valuations go up, then the rate has to go down. Okay? So what this is telling you, and this is, everything I'm showing you is from the 2022 tax classification hearing that the Mashpee Select Board had. So these are real data for Mashpee, 2 years old. this type of analysis wasn't completely done for last year, so I had to go back 2 years to find it. But what this tells you is, on the right-hand side, how significantly the value of the property has gone up in Mashpee. So if you apply that to the formula, since the rate of growth exceeds 2.5%, which is the allowed amount, you can increase your total tax collections every year without special voter permission. So the rate of value has grossly exceeded, rate of value increase grossly exceeded the 2.5% limit. So the rate goes down. And what gets talked about more than anything else, Mashpee Select Board, other boards, people get judged on the rate. You know, our tax rate went down. Most people know whether their tax rate went up or down. Most people don't have a great sense off the top of their head whether their values are up or down. Okay? So understanding this phenomenon and then how it plays back into the application or decision about a residential exemption is really important. Mashpee's rate has pretty much gone down, 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 but your tax bills have not. So people fixate on the rate. People, town staff proudly talk about bringing the rate down. They don't tell you because your values went up, your tax bill's actually going up, but your rate went down. I'm certain, I don't have it, that Mashpee's rate is in the lower half of Cape Towns, and I think it's no higher than 5th. Okay, so relative to other Cape Towns, Mashpee's pretty low, just over $7, I think, this year. The lowest is Chatham, it's in the 3s, but that's because property value so outrageously up. Chatham's different than any other Cape Town or Cape Cod. Uniformly high, the valuation of Chatham. Off the charts, the rate was low when they set 2.5 in the 80s, and it stayed low because values have gone up. So this, largely an unintelligible sheet, is what Mashpee Select Board was given 2 years ago in deriving at the determination to do a 5% residential tax exemption. And what it shows you is, on the left-hand side here, those are the full-time residential taxpayers who would theoretically qualify. There are 2,109 properties that were believed to be full-time residences. 9,048 are second homes or non-exempt. Okay, so that's really important to understand about how this plays out in Mashpee, because the second homeowner market dominates the residential property case. The other thing that dominates the property tax base in Mashpee is residential is 90-something% of the taxable properties in town. Commercial side, industrial side, very small. Way smaller. I don't know what Barnstable is, but it's a lot smaller.
Yeah, we have a substantial.
Yeah, they have a substantial commercial base. Mashpee probably looks more like most Cape Towns than Barnstable does, but this is really heavily weighted toward residential. So what is done on the residential side pretty much calls the shots. Okay, Mashpee does not have a differential tax rate to tax residential properties and commercial properties at the same rate. If you wanted to adjust the residential taxpayer burden by taxing your commercial properties at a different rate, it would have to be a lot higher to make a difference because it's only 10%, roughly 10% of the base. So if you want to do something about residential tax burden, and we'll leave aside whether you think it's a spending problem or a taxing problem for a minute, but if you're going to collect a certain amount of money and apply it to town functions, this mechanism is the only realistic mechanism that the select board, not only Mashpee, but any other town has. The only knob they have to turn, really, that makes any difference. The other things that are interesting about this chart are funny the way it was presented. Reduction and increase in taxes. So the reductions are actually shown as a positive number. The increases are shown as a negative, which is counterintuitive to the way most accounting would handle it. So the way to read this chart is to see here that that column represents the reduced tax bill by virtue of the application of a 5% exemption. And what you'll see is, and this will carry through at 5, 10, all the way to 35%. The value is higher at the lower value. The value of the benefit is higher at the lower end than at the higher end. And the reason for that is the exempted amount is a larger percentage of the total value of lower value properties than it is higher value properties. More math. So from a tax progressiveness point of view, the highest benefit is in the lowest value properties. Okay? So, you know, in the 5% example, which is actually what happened, properties of less than $200,000, or yeah, $200,000, had a tax bill of $1,900. It went down to $1,700, so they saved $214. And that's a real example, because that's pretty much what happened. When you move down to properties, you have to go all the way down to properties valued between 2 and 3 million. To actually, you get properties above 3 million before the people who are eligible, as the previous speaker mentioned, pay more. Okay? So, of the residential class that's eligible, a whopping 7 properties saw an increase in their taxes. And without making a social commentary, I think the owner of a $3 million home probably didn't notice the $25. As we go through examples, 2 more examples, that break-even point shifts upward, shifts to lower, still high-value properties, but further up the scale, right? The other interesting thing when you look at real-world Mashpee is that left-hand column, number of owner-occupied properties, shows you that the majority of eligible full-time properties are worth less than $700,000 2 years ago. So the bulk of the universe that would benefit from this are people who own properties that they're not inexpensive, because there aren't any inexpensive properties on the Cape anymore, but on the lower half of the spectrum here. So, you know, you can make whatever assumptions you want about who lives in what valuation house and who benefits from it, and whether that makes a big difference to them or doesn't make a big difference to them. But it's indisputable by the town's own data that people who own, you know, under $700,000 properties would reap a larger benefit and represent a large majority of the properties who would benefit from this. The other side of the equation is properties that are ineligible and how that 5% applies to them. And again, the same dynamics are at play. The increases for the non-eligible properties are much lower at the lower end of the value spectrum, much higher at the bottom. Why? Because you're multiplying a high property value to an elevated rate. And so the number goes up. That said, for the $3 million and up home, the impact was $311. It's more than 25. But again, ask yourself, relative burden versus benefit, is that an appropriate place to end up from a social contract point of view? And you all can make your own decisions, okay? But the reason why this chart plays out is, as was explained to you before, when you exempt a value based on 5 to 35% from taxation, back to your algebra, your equation, fixed amount of collections, less amount of assessed property value, the rate has to go back up to make that math work. So, to the higher value non-exempt properties, you're applying a higher rate. So the rate goes up. The rate goes up. In a residential exemption qualified town that's doing the program, the rate is higher than it would be with a non-exemption program. Always. Okay? But how it impacts you is a function of whether you qualify or not and what the value of your property is. So another example, not to belabor the point. In fact, I'm not going to do 3, I'm going to do 2. This is a 20% exemption. 15% below the max. Again, you'll see for the lower value properties, the number increases significantly, goes up to $884. For the non-exempt $3 million property, it goes up by $1,200. Over here, those that benefit, instead of just being, or those who pay more even though they're qualified, goes from the $3 million up class to somewhere in the million to 2 million class. This doesn't, we're not provided a particularly clear point where the break even is, so I don't know from the data that was provided where in the $1 to $2 million range. But let's assume it's all of them. It's still 165 properties. So again, with a residential exemption of 20%, only 160 out of 2,100 eligible properties see an increase. Almost 2,000 homes see a decrease. Everybody on this side of the spectrum who's not included will see an increase. And this summarizes it. So your residential tax rate without an exemption is $694. I think it ended up with 5% being $701. So the tax rate went up 6 cents. But this summary gives you, it shows you roughly, how much dollar value is exempt in each piece. 33,000, double that, 66, and then you double it again at 133. So you see, at the higher value, again, going back to the lower value properties, you're exempting 133,000 of a $200,000 property from taxation, even at that higher rate. That's why you get the big savings, because so much of it is not subject to the calculation. So, and then you see, so down here, so residential exemption was what they did, 701 from 694. Even if you went to the 20%, your rate goes from 694 to 722. You're still in the bottom half of taxation rates on Cape Cod, I guarantee it. And then the average, the amount per parcel ranges from 233 to 960. So that's pretty much how it works. It's actually not very complicated. You can make it really complicated if you want to. How the process works, the decision on setting the tax rate and whether you're going to have an application of residential exemption is solely within the domain of the 5 members who are elected to the select board. So, Board of Assessors holds a hearing and a meeting. They talk to the assessor, they go through all this data, they make a recommendation. The assessor brings that recommendation to the select board. It has typically, and you said the date, Marge, I missed it, but typically in early November.
November 6th.
November 6th this year. Board of Selectmen has a public hearing. They get presented this information. There's an opportunity for public comment, and then they vote. They vote to whether to have a difference, a differential tax rate between residential and commercial. Town has never done that. Inconceivable to me that they'll ever do it anytime soon. I'm not saying they should. They decide whether there's a differential tax rate, and then they decide, in a 2-part question, will there be residential exemption? And if so, at what rate? They are at 5 now. They were at 5 in 2022. 2023 for this fiscal year. They'll be deciding what that rate is for the next year. They can go up, they can go down, they can stay the same. And if you have an interest in this, I would encourage you, because it is a public hearing, to show up. This packet of information will be made available not far in advance, but typically the morning of the meeting, online, on the select board part of the website. You can see how it would play out for you. And if you have a feeling about it, pro or con, go tell them. If you don't tell them, they don't know what you think. And therefore, if they don't know what you think, they're not going to give any weight to what you think. They may or may not give weight to what you think, even if you tell them. But if you don't tell them, you don't give them the chance. And then they're going to vote that night, and then it's done. So you get one bite at this apple. And so if you think this is a good idea, tell them. If you think it's a terrible idea, tell them. And see what happens. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Arden is collecting questions. And you can keep feeding us questions because we have at least 45 minutes to get the questions in. Well, we can screen if necessary.
Does anybody need a card to write a question?
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, we have a variety of questions here. I guess I could read the questions. Okay. How has the tax exemption affected the Barnstable budget?
In Barnstable, we've had this program for a number of years right now. So when we are doing our budget, it's our levy that we're concentrating on, the amount of money that we have to raise. It does affect some of our higher end. We have some high-end properties in town that, they do pay more because of the increased mill rate that they have to pay on that. But it's all baked into our budget. We've had this in place for years now in Barnstable, and it's no surprise coming at us on the budget. We know that we have the residential tax rate, and in Barnstable it actually muddies it a little more because we have to do it separately for each fire district as well. But it has really no impact on our budget because we know it's coming. It's not a surprise to us.
So one way to think about this is it's budget neutral. Town's collecting the same amount of money. It's allocated, and it comes to us differently than it otherwise would in a natural state, but from the same amount of money. Didn't affect Mashpee's budget one penny.
Except if they had to hire more staff. I know that was the comment made by the assessor's office. I don't know how Barnstable will handle that.
Because we are a larger community, we have a larger assessor's office anyways. But we have dedicated people in everything is very time specific in the assessor's office. We have a lot of due dates. So we do spend a lot of resources. We have to vet every application that comes in, make sure that they are a resident of the town, make sure that they occupied that house as of January 1st of the fiscal year. So there are more resources to do it. Barnstable was able to absorb it pretty easily. Our assessor staff is 11, and fluctuates from 9 to 12 people over the years. And we have dedicated people that will, admin staff that can pull all that in and manage the program. So it all depends on the setup of your assessor's office and what their staffing levels currently are. But there is absolutely more work involved with it.
So for Mashpee, in 2021, I think, town meeting appropriated some money to enable them to incur one-time costs to alter the assessing system so that it could have the fields necessary to enter in the tax exemption. Because one of the problems Mashpee always confronted was by the time you did the tax hearing and set the rate, there wasn't time to do the mechanics behind implementing the project and not run into trouble collecting the amount of money that you needed to collect. So the town did spend some upfront money preparing itself for this, so that it now had the opportunity, once the select board in 22 decided they wanted to do that. But that was kind of one-time cost, one-time setup cost. And I wouldn't bet my life on it, but I'm pretty sure they didn't hire additional staff in the assessor department to implement it.
And once the program is in place, the residents that are in it last year, most likely, unless they sell a house, are staying in the program. So we have that there. You know, there'll be some new residents that come in that you have to process and get them into the system. But, you know, we track in Barnstable with deeds. So whenever a property sells, as we're updating the deed, we go to that field on the exemption. Okay, they were a full-time resident before they sold the house. We take them out of the program, the new person will have to apply. So it does get a little easier because you don't have to touch every application every single year. Once they're in the program.
Okay, we had an elaboration of that question about the cost to the town to implement and maintain the program. And then our finance director initially said that they didn't have the staff to vet resident versus non-resident status and to adjust billing. I think you answered that. What is the overall tax increase to establish and maintain this plan?
Well, all I can tell you is what the facts were. The Board of Selectmen voted to do it, and they did it. So they found a way to manage it within the resources that they had made available to them. You know, and off the top of my head, I don't remember what the appropriation was in 2021, but it was not a lot of money.
Are you automatically exempted, or do you have to apply?
You have to apply. So
We did have some application blanks on the table. You can get it online.
And even, you know, so the town has a little application form. They sent them out to everybody back in 22. You had a certain amount of time to return them, fill out the application form, and then you provide, I think, a redacted version of your federal 1040 form that showed your legal address. So, you know, if you're defrauding the feds, you can defraud the town. That's up to you. But it was not a particularly onerous or cumbersome thing to fill out. And then once you're in, it asks nothing of you as an individual to stay in. You know, it happened in 22. Tax bills went out the following year with no additional burden on the taxpayer to provide any additional data.
How does the town determine if you qualify for the exemption, meaning that you're a full-time resident? This person says, I completed a form last year, provided a tax return as documentation. How do I know if I qualified for the exemption?
Your tax bill would indicate whether the exemption was applied by showing your total property valuation and then the tax value upon which it's assessed. If there was a problem with it, or you have questions, I would encourage you to call the assessor's department or pop into town hall and talk to them and say, what happened here? If you were inappropriately excluded, you know, the town has something called an overlay surplus reserve that enables them to make corrections. So if you're wrongly denied the benefit, you have the ability to seek some redress.
It could be settled through the abatement process.
Right.
Just
What
like
would
an
it
abatement.
say on your tax bill? Like, I pulled it up online before I came, and I did not see anything about any sort of exemption on the bill.
Off the top of my head, I don't know what the tax bill would say, but the assessor's department is very helpful. Call Trish. She'll help.
I called, they told me, because I don't think they sent notices in Mashpee.
Yeah, I know it's possible, we don't have a line item on your tax bill that will show the residential exemption on it. But you can look at your value, you know, every tax bill is gonna show you what you're being assessed on. And you could see that here's the fair and full market value from the property record card, and here is your exempt value that you are being taxed on. So that could be a clue that you're in the program on that.
Call Trish.
Renters do not pay property tax, the owners will. Pass the increase on to the tenants. Any comment on that?
You know, they very well might, because, you know, it's a non-owner occupied property. So it is a residential property, but non-owner occupied, so they will not qualify for the residential exemption. That may be a business decision that they choose to make to pass that cost on. You know, it varies from property owner to property owner and how they choose to deal with that.
How many years has Mashpee had a residential tax exemption?
Since it was adopted in November of 2022 and applied to fiscal year 2023. We're in 24 now, and next year the decision made on November 6th will be for 25. So this will, if it continues, it would be the third year.
Can there be an exemption for seniors under a certain income?
So the state already offers that. The state already offers a senior exemption. There are income and asset guidelines to that. But you should contact your assessor's office. They'd be happy to explain them. These are readily available programs. A lot of people take advantage of them. And you could theoretically get the residential exemption and a senior exemption. Just because you get one doesn't exclude you from the other.
Oh my goodness, she's like,
Oh, okay. Wow, that's 100. Why is Mashpee at only 5% compared to Barnstable and other towns at 25?
We're at 25%. I think Provincetown is at 35% the max. It can only be from 5% to 35. That is your range. No, I can't speak to why Mashpee did that. That's a select board decision. You know, it's a fairly new program in town. They might have been considering that, but
Yeah, Wellfleet's at 35%. They went from 5 to 35 in 1 year. And I think I was there for another reason with the conversation, was I think about 2 minutes long. Truro just voted to go to 35 in the last couple of weeks. Mashpee's at 5 because that's what the select board did.
Why should those who live here only part-time with little infrastructure impact pay more than those in the school system year-round, ambulatory, septic, fire, police needs?
I have opinions, but you said this is just the facts. I mean, it's a question that is integral to this particular mechanism.
it's a function of the program.
It's a function of the program, it's a function of what the legislature authorized to be done, and you can land legitimately on any side of that equation you want to. It's a reality of the program. It shifts cost burden from full-time to part-time.
Okay, some of these are a little repetitive. For large apartment complexes, non-resident, and example number 2 at 35% showed additional taxes of $31,500. Isn't it likely that this additional tax value is being transferred to renters?
That's a Barnstable question.
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. You know, once again, a business decision for the property owner on how they choose to budget their business. But I can see that thought. You know, if they're paying more in taxes, it does trickle down to the rent. So I can see that possibly affecting the rents.
It's not much of a Mashpee issue because we don't have large rental properties, anything like
We have 90
Barnstable
other
has.
complexes.
We don't have any of that right now.
you have rental homes.
But just in terms of the number of units, no.
The other part of this question is a comment. So aren't we merely raising rentals for those who cannot afford housing, ultimately hurting the lower income residents?
Maybe.
This is a question I think I can answer. I was told, the person says, I was told one had to reapply each year in Mashpee. No. Once you apply, that's it. You can call the office to make sure they got your application and see what they decided.
What we do in Barnstable, we run a report every year, and people that have been in for 10 years, we'll mail them out a new application because we'll want to see, make sure that they're still there after 10 years. So every 10 years is when we'll follow up. But as I said, as properties sell, we're always checking them. When we update the ownership, we also check on the residential exemption and adjust accordingly at the time of sale.
Once applied for, when and how is it applied?
So all applications have to be in by April 1st of that fiscal year. You can start submitting them on July 1st, the first day of the fiscal year, and you almost have that full 9 months to get that application in. If you get it in April, you could get that exemption to show on your fourth quarter bill for the quarterly towns. If it comes in earlier, all exemptions are always going to show on the actual tax bill, so either your third or fourth quarter bill. It's just the timing of when you get it in and we can process it. But the year you apply, as long as you're eligible, you'll get in for that fiscal year.
I don't know Mashpee mechanics in detail.
Okay, are you thinking of the secondary impacts to those longstanding non-residents who own summer cottages that have been in their family for years? With increases, they may now decide to sell. This only increases the odds of development to more residents with more infrastructure demands, thus the need to increase taxes for all.
I would say we were tasked today with telling you how it works. That's how it works. If that's a concern, and I've heard it, go tell the select board. And that may influence what they decide to do with this program.
Will this exemption affect your veterans' exemptions?
It will not, just as I was mentioning, the senior exemption. You can still get your veterans exemption and the residential exemption. So it would not affect your veterans exemption at all.
Long question here. The information on your low rate of those seeing a tax increase of only 165 residents with 100,000, well, with $1 million or more valuation in property is based on fiscal year 23 tax info, whose evaluation rates were likely based on fiscal year 2021 valuations. So in fiscal year 2025, there will be way more $1 million valued homes, which is becoming more average. This information is dated and misleading. The question of the person is, how many $1 million homes exist today? Certainly way more than 165.
So I thought I gave the caveat that the information I'm showing you was from 2022 because it wasn't produced in this format by the town in 2023. One would expect the assessors to do a chart much like this that updates the existing information, and the math is going to shift. So I'm not trying to mislead anybody. I'm just using, rather than make up data, I was using the most recent data that the select board has published that depicted the decision-making process at that point. they should have an updated version of this, and the numbers will shift. I think your premise that there's more higher value properties and that the base has gone up is absolutely correct. What that means in terms of where that break-even point falls will change. I think it will push it a little bit higher because there's more valuation being assessed than less. Where those numbers are, I don't know. That's the assessor's job to present. And that should be presented at the select board, and if you don't see it, you should ask for it, because it's a good question and something everybody ought to know. But this is complicated. I mean, there's a lot of input into this. I mean, you got 11 people running these numbers in Barnstable. So, I'm not crazy enough to try and do back of the envelope calculations on what it looks like 3 years later, but the assessors do, and they know, and they should tell you.
Well, that's it on the questions in writing. If anybody has follow-up questions, or if the audience who will watch this on video have questions, put them on our Facebook page messaging, and I will ask our speakers to do overtime work and answer those questions, because I think it's important. I thank everybody for coming, and I hope that you will come to the November 6th Select Board hearing at 5 o'clock on, it's a Wednesday, I believe, 5 o'clock at Town Hall, and tell them what you think and ask your questions then. Because this is an important program. I think it benefits a lot of people, and we want more people to know. So we have no idea how many people will come to this meeting.
Just one thing, I just want to thank Marge and the gentleman for coming today. I think it was a very informative meeting, and thank you for